Thank you, Hanna. Thanks again for the invitation. It was great to be here 3 years ago, and it's always great to be back. In fact, I've been back 4 times since, which means that the network that my colleagues described actually exists. Now, go back to the substance, if you want. There is an interesting perspective if we are looking at Central Asia from Russia perspective, or better, at Russia from Central Asia perspective. 24 December 1991, the meeting that established the CIS, Nazarbayev described the relationship of the region with Russia, calling Russia the authoritative uncle of Central Asia. Now, regardless of not we accept this definition, that's how one of the most prominent leaders of the region saw Russia in 1991. Soviet legacies, economic linkages, cultural ties were all sort of connected into that discussion. But the framework that suggests today departs from that characterization and really distinguishes between how Russia is seen by the elites and by the people in Central Asia. So this is the first sort of snapshot I'd like to give you. The fact is that there is no such thing as the Central Asians look at Russia from this perspective. No, not only we need to distinguish between the 5 states, and I'm going to go around in like 10 minutes that I have, but also we have to distinguish between what the people think and what the elite thinks. Now, Anna said that, you know, I'm one of those few people who does Turkmenistan. Obviously, I'm not allowed in, so the problem is that talking with the people, it's in some cases difficult, because up until last year, you could do only serious field work in 2 of the 5 countries, really. Only Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan allowed to do political science work. But we'll try to sort of reconstruct, sort of with broader sort of picture what's going on. So this is the first distinction I suggest. State on the one end, elite, and people on the other. The second one is that the 5 states consider Russia for a variety of reasons: economic, energy, cultural, political, proximity, ethnic, in 5 different ways. Which goes back to the core of my intervention today. There is no such thing as one Central Asia when it comes to Russia. You have to distinguish between the 5, and in most cases, within each of the 5. And this clearly addresses one of the key issues for area studies. I like how you referred to that, Jeremy, that we cannot look at these 5 states with this great game, big perspective. They are independent, autonomous actors that have to be analyzed with the same respect and understanding that we would give to any Western state. So in that sense, I advocate that there is no connection between the great game that brings Russia, China, Iran, and the US against each other in Central Asia. What I'm saying is that the states are the most important actors, and in that sense, we have to distinguish. There is a further complication. Is that the relationship between Central Asia and Russia is not only played in Central Asia, but it's played in Russia too, because we have significant numbers of Central Asians living in Russia as migrants. So in that sense, we have a further complication that it becomes a domestic issue for the states and for Russia itself. So a significant portion of the GDPs of Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan is actually produced in Russia and is remitted back to Russia, to the states, which means that the GDP, the domestic, in fact, is Russia. So the intertwining of what's domestic in Dushanbe and what's domestic in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, is surprisingly interlinked. So quickly, I'm going to move between the 5, and I like to start with my guys, Turkmenistan. It's difficult to understand what's going on. I mean, a preliminary caveat here is that I think that in the shorter term, 5 to 10 years, we will see significant leadership change in Central Asia. Not regime change, but the people who are in power are either old or not well enough or not stable enough to stay. So in probably 10 years, we will have 5 different, well, at least 3 different leaders in Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. And of course, Kyrgyzstan elects its leader, so we'll have a new one in October anyway. So this ties back with my point about the elites, is that we are at a time of leadership change at Genova. So whatever relationship they have with Putin will have to be rediscussed both at domestic level and international level. So when it comes to Turkmenistan, it's really difficult because the country is in an unprecedented economic crisis. The money just not flowing in for the China pipeline. So there is a lot going on about the viability of the current system of authoritarian management of the resources. And there is a chance that the states who has been using the buzzword neutrality to describe its own position is actually coming out of the isolation, which is what they mean by neutrality, to go back into whatever close ties with Moscow is. Especially because it will take only a $2 billion loan from Russia to Turkmenistan to keep the system going on. And that kind of ties is not forgotten very easily. Because also it will serve Bedi Muhamedov, who is the president, in the shorter run, so to ensure stability. So there's a big question mark over there. Then we have Kyrgyzstan, interesting case, because it's always been described as the sort of most open of the 5 states. It is easiest to access, but it's also the one where if you look at the polls and opinion polls and also views of the people, is the most conservative when it comes to the kind of issues that have been promoted by the Russian when it comes to authoritarian diffusion of media law, anti-homophobic laws, and that kind of stuff. It's the most sort of closest to Russia. Kyrgyzstan is a big question mark as well because they have the election in 2 months exactly. So we know that the weight of remittances force them in the Eurasian Economic Union so that they get closer to Russia and get their citizen a free visa system then. But the application of that law, and that goes back to what I would say this afternoon about connectivity, it's problematic. I'll give an example. The border between Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan shouldn't exist because they're both part of the EU, but it does exist. So we got the different perception of what the relationship with Russia does for the states, which allows them to have this protection and the continuation of their own policies. But also, it doesn't bring benefit to the people. The very same people, though, that for some reason actually support Russia. So, again, it's very complex to go into this in 10 minutes, but I'll try to keep going on. Then we've got Tajikistan, which is in a very similar position to Kyrgyzstan, to the extent to which we know that Russia is virtually controlling the borders, is somehow propping up the government, but it's not involved in the murky politics that goes on within the Rahmon family. So my idea is that what I hear from my colleagues who live and work there, the president is not that well. That's why we will see probably in that state the first dynastic succession in the next 10 years. So more than the relationship between the Russian and the people and the president, I'd be interested to see what the Kremlin thinks of the son of the president who's supposed to take in charge when Rahmon goes. The most interesting of the 5 is Uzbekistan as far as I'm concerned. Because, and again, goes back to what I was saying this afternoon, we are witnessing what may be significant change. This is the biggest population, this is the geographically center of the region, is not the biggest sort of geographically in terms of resources, but it's probably the key player of proper Central Asia. And what we've seen is that the leadership change of last September actually instigated a kind of progressive, very slow alteration of how Uzbekistan sees itself with the region. And we've seen, and also again, this goes back to the work I'm doing with Radio Free Europe, we've seen that the people in the provinces especially are starting to look at Russia from not that perspective that was given to the Karimov fight, the former president, but in a way in which there could be more collaboration, especially because the diaspora is so consistent with, the Uzbek diaspora is so consistent within Moscow and St. Petersburg especially. Kazakhstan is the odd one out because we have significant ethnic minorities there, which Russia who lives with Kazakhstan. So the relationship that goes between Astana and Moscow is clearly perceived through the eyes of those 20-25% of people who are actually ethnic Russian in Kazakhstan. So Nazarbayev knows that. He managed to get Kazakhstan into the EU, even though, and I go back to what this afternoon, the idea that integration is associated to Vanity Fairs for the president actually was destroyed by Putin because he managed to have its own project running, has brought Russia and Kazakhstan probably the closest, but also the furthest away. Because now criticizing Russia is one of the few critics to the government which is allowed within Kazakhstan. It's surprisingly, the political space is shrinking, and the only issue up for grabs is foreign policy. And people decide to criticize Russia in order to criticize Nazarbayev. So it becomes even more complicated in that sense. So, because I don't want to be told off by Anna, I'm going to close off with this proposition. There is no such thing as one view of Russia. There are at least 10 different views, 5 from the states and 5 from the population. But even then, it's more complex than that. Having said that, though, Russia does not act in a vacuum in Central Asia. We have other sort of partners that to be taken consideration, and China and Iran, as far as I'm concerned, are the most important. Not only because of proximity, of energy relations, of cultural ties, but also because the region has proved open enough to these big states to have a different panoply of options for the states and for the regional state. And this is my last comment. Thank you.